Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director, and it's great to have you with us. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Robin Alden. Robin, one starting point for her sort of adult life was that she was a member of Yale's first co-ed class, I think. And that ought to just remind some of the folks in the audience, there was a time that some of the women here at some of the universities in our country, you wouldn't have been here. So maybe we make progress even when it doesn't seem like we're making enough fast enough, but that's pretty amazing. And she took a year off from college to write for a weekly newspaper in, of all places, Stonington. And that year changed the course of her life, especially by the way it informed her view about the connections between fishing communities and fisheries, between economies and the environment, and the ways in which these can be sustained or not by governance. A few years later, she founded Commercial Fisheries News, a Northeast regional trade newspaper, where she worked for the next 20 years. With Jim Wilson, an emeritus professor here at UMaine, who helped build the foundation for the Mitchell Center itself. With Jim, she launched and managed the Maine Fisheries Forum, which is a very important gathering for everybody connected to fisheries in this part of the world. After that, she served as the Commissioner of Marine Resources under Governor Angus King during his first term. And in 2003, she established Penobscot East Resource Center, now known as the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, with her husband, who we're lucky to have here, Ted Ames. And she led it for 15 years. I can't begin to give a fitting introduction to Ted, so I'm just going to say that he combines the skills of a fisherman, a scientist, and a historian in ways that not only netted him a MacArthur Genius Prize, no pun intended about the netting, his work helped motivate one of the world's most ambitious ecological restoration projects right here in the Penobscot River Basin. Robin's awards, back to her side of the partnership, if her awards were strung together end to end, they would stretch at least from Stonington to the Georges Bank, if not all the way out to the Sargasso Sea. Last year, Robin wrote a profoundly important paper in a special ocean issue of Maine Policy Review about the lessons for the future from 50 years of Maine fisheries, which is one of the things I was really glad to hear that she would be willing to come and talk with us about. Please join me in welcoming Robin back to the Mitchell Center, where she always has been, always will be, a major source of inspiration for our work. Robin.
Well, good afternoon. And just to show you that we all put our pants on one leg at a time, I spent those 25 years as an editor, and I noticed that I misspelled George Mitchell's name. So, we're all quite human, despite beautiful introductions like that. Thank you, David. So I'm going to move right along past this slide, which is bothering me. I'm so glad to be speaking here, giving a sustainability lecture. That really has been my life's work, trying to think about how do we do this. As David said, when I was 21, taking that year off from college, I was captivated by the commercial fishing industry. It seemed to me to be the perfect epitome of the human purpose, to sustain ourselves within the bounds of the ecosystem that we're a part of. It was the early 70s. I was 21, still grieving my father's untimely death 5 years before. He'd been a medieval history teacher and an amateur naturalist and a sailor and a mariner. And in a tribute to him that was written by one of his coworkers, they said that he was interested always in the whole of anything. And they went on to describe sailing and how that's an integration of so many different factors. And then talked about the connections between the human and the natural world that was so important to him. And the fact that those systems are not gentle or just, but they fit together. So I've always gone for the whole. I am a lumper, not a splitter. I eagerly lap up contributions that splitters make to our understanding of the detail of the natural and human systems. And I try to combine them into a sensible whole that would put humans into the natural world in a sustainable way. I see our human systems, networks, and economies intertwined with all that complexity of the natural world. And I understand, as I have learned about fishing, that these systems are not always gentle, but I want them to be sustainable. So climate change is waking all of us up. We have to look at the whole. As the climate changes, it's dawning on us that even our 21st century lives are part of the natural world. We aren't safe in our indoor places anymore, our urban centers, and the futuristic stainless steel world of sci-fi won't save us either. We just can't successfully separate ourselves from natural processes. Our actions affect those processes. And of course, you all know this. Fishermen know this too. They know it even as they often pursue catches that are unsustainable. That reality is present every day in their world. The challenge of fisheries is to conduct a modern business within the bounds of an ecosystem so that we can fish forever. I suggest that fishing has something to teach us in Maine right now, right here. Fishing's failures and its successes and new social and ecological research provide insight into the opportunity that we have right now, perched on the edge of industrialization of the Gulf of Maine with offshore wind and large-scale ocean aquaculture. As the state and federal government pours billions of dollars into aquaculture and wind, and economic development promoters and politicians tout thousands of new jobs and untold values for the state, pause for me just this afternoon. Take a moment and let's look at what we can learn from fishing. As I said, fishing has an aspirational goal to create value operating within Maine, the Gulf of Maine's changing natural ecology. To be successful long-term, fishing absolutely must operate within the Gulf's ecological bounds. Fishing's production depends on the health of the Gulf. In contrast, the wind industry and large-scale aquaculture are using the Gulf as a place to site a factory. The Gulf is a place to do business, a place for people to have jobs, to execute a business plan, and generate returns for investors. There's a big disconnect between those two goals. Fishing really is the odd duck. Picture an industry for which the engine of production is beyond human control. That's fishing. Picture an industry that caps production in order to succeed. It's fishing. Now picture a successful business that curtails technological efficiency, limits business structure to a single person with rights they cannot monetize, imposes limits on time and place of business, and for which the engine of production, as I said, is beyond human control. That's fishing. In fact, that's the $464 million lobster industry in Maine, pursued by thousands of lobster license holders and their crew. How unlikely. On land, most of us have largely given up thinking about the natural productivity of a given place. For example, when the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company planned its 1,100-acre chips plant north of Phoenix, it was an afterthought to consider saving native trees. And I've seen no discussion of the ecosystem functions that would be lost by covering 1,100 acres. I think I said 11,000. I meant 1,100. On land, we aren't hunter-gatherers anymore. Since the environmental laws of the 1970s, the US has been backing into the importance of terrestrial and freshwater systems piecemeal with zoning, setbacks, vernal pool protection, erosion control, endangered species protection, wrangling over predator restoration. But it's all that is a patchwork, an add-on to how we've used land for centuries. Land is firmly in private control, not a common property resource like the ocean. Most food production comes from agriculture. Our systems have difficulty recognizing that wild land is that wild land is giving us ecosystem services that are important to our air and water. Land's a place to build houses, factories, hospitals, parking lots, and later waste facilities, whether it's the old Model T and a bottle pile back behind the house, or the wasteland of former strip malls or regional dumps, a very non-PC term. The ocean is different. It is common property. It can, on its own, produce a bounty of protein at a scale that we can hardly imagine. Furthermore, human life on the planet depends on the ocean being a healthy, functioning natural system so that the planet can breathe. The ocean produces more than half the oxygen in our atmosphere from its plankton. We here in Maine are lucky that our marine environment, the Gulf of Maine, has not yet been industrialized. Gravel mining and offshore oil drilling were stopped in the 70s. The Pittston oil refinery was never built in Eastport. We have been lucky with good pilots and skippers and have had few oil spills. There's a vast difference between siting your plant in a place and using the natural productivity of that place. So, fishing. Fishing is part of, as all of you connected with the Mitchell Center know, a socio-ecological system. You spend your lives consciously working within these systems, which are technically complex adaptive systems. Understanding of systems like this emerged out of computer science and chaos theory in the 1980s and 90s. Outcomes from changes in these systems are not predictable, but the systems are not without order. Oversimplifying, they are made up of many nested layers of organization or structure. New, different, and unpredictable outcomes, paths, behaviors can and do emerge as conditions change. This view is a far cry from a business plan for a wind or aquaculture facility. Inputs in, outputs out. Keep that in mind as we look at the bad news of fisheries. For much of the last 50 years, New England fisheries have been promoted, developed, and managed much like a normal business. As a result, most of the Gulf of Maine fisheries have failed to live up to the aspirational goal of producing value in a modern way within the bounds of a marine system. Indeed, this approach has contributed to degrading the health of the Gulf. It started with the Magnuson Act, now called the Sustainable Fisheries Act. Now we think of it as a fisheries management law, but it started as an economic development tool. In the early 70s, when I started my work in fisheries, as many as 250 fishing vessels and their tankers, processors, freezer boats, hospital ships were fishing off New England. These were vessels that were between 200 and 400 feet long. The Gulf of Maine's fishing grounds had been devastated, stripped. The foreign vessels fished in company, seeking and targeting schools of cod, haddock, herring, squid, mackerel, their lights lighting up offshore like cities. The boats came from Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Poland, both Germanies, Romania, the Soviet Union, and Japan. They were using electronics and fishing gear that US fishermen hadn't even dreamed of. I say all this because it's hard to imagine that this could ever have been possible. Maine fishermen, Maine politicians, and all those in the rest of New England were desperate to stop this. They wanted a 200-mile limit to Americanize and modernize the fishery. Economic development gurus salivated. A 2-year University of Rhode Island study stated that with a 200-mile limit, quote, New England fishermen are standing on the threshold of a new and better era. A bonanza of fish resources lying off the New England coast. I think people had forgotten that the reason they were doing this was because the fish had been devastated. They valued this bonanza at $250 million annually. That would be 1.4 billion in current dollars. I was part of a Maine Sea Grants study led by Jim Wilson, who David mentioned, to examine how Maine could take advantage of the opportunities that would come from this new law. It passed in 1976, and it unleashed a rush of private and public investment in boats and gear. The Maine fishery moved from marinized gas engines to diesels, from wood to fiberglass, from natural fibers to synthetic ropes and nets, from virtually no electronics to what we have now, GPS, radar, and sonars that allow fishermen to see in the water. They can see fish and they can see boulders on the bottom and return to precise locations in the open ocean. This has been an amazing transformation. We've also had this comparable explosion of technology on the research side, analyzing fish stocks, bottom types, plankton, and currents. There's no denying it now. We have declared war on fish and we've won. But we also have the tools to analyze and understand far more about what we're doing to marine systems. We have learned so much about the complexities of the Gulf of Maine. Think just of the work being done here at UMaine. We know that cod and herring and many other species have local populations specific even to certain bays. We have learned that fish are social animals, dependent on large fish for learning about key aspects of their lives, migration and spawning locations. We know far more than we ever did about the planktonic stages of commercial fisheries and the impact of temperature and ocean chemistry on them. We've learned about the currents, things we never knew about the nearshore currents in the Gulf of Maine, including the Eastern Maine coastal current. And we know far more about the significance of rivers and anadromous fish to the health of the marine system and vice versa. Most of this knowledge hasn't made it into fisheries management yet. As the science of human complex systems has developed, we also aren't using that new knowledge in most fisheries applications. Instead, the legal structure we're working under continues to use more of the production line approach. Think of it, less than 100 years before the Sustainable Fisheries Act, leading scientist Aldous Huxley stated that the great sea fisheries were inexhaustible. The Act still contains echoes of this. It was written as an economic development act focused on making sure that US fishermen would catch and sell the quote, optimum yield. If US boats could not catch that amount, it would have to be given that year to foreign vessels to catch. And the act specifically required catching those fish in the most efficient manner, technically efficient. Of course, the act, as you know, also instituted the first ever comprehensive federal management of fisheries. Before that, most fisheries regulations had occurred at the state level without firm scientific underpinnings. Federal approach enshrined the 1950s concept of maximum sustainable yield for commercially valuable species, one species at a time, all maximized or optimized simultaneously. For any of those of you who've had a math class, you may be scratching your head. Under tight federal management control, the biological aspects have been managed on the assertion, unsupported scientifically, that it is possible to predict future population levels of any one species, cod, haddock, herring, by controlling how much fish of that species is caught in a given year. So fishery managers count fish of each commercially valuable species and measure success against population growth. On the socioeconomic side, the metrics are on efficiency, consolidation of rights to harvest, and reduction of the number of fishermen. It's been an input-output manufacturing strategy, but it turns out that the ocean was operating the plant, not the managers. And so fishing has become somewhat of a mining operation with efficient extraction of a few species as the goal. Ever since the first year of setting federal quotas, the system has lurched from one crisis to another. In New England, the results are abysmal, despite shifting baselines and a number of bureaucratic definitions of overfishing. Record in our primary fisheries, groundfish and herring, is terrible. A few graphs will tell the story. So this is the state of Maine cod landings. The red arrow indicates when the Sustainable Fisheries Act was first passed, instituted. And on the side, the figures are all states for the Gulf of Maine. And it will show that there's a 98% reduction in the allowable catch of cod in New England. It's an absolutely stunning record. And in the eastern Gulf of Maine, from Penobscot Bay east, the fish stocks collapsed in the mid-90s, and they have never recovered. This was one of the impetuses for my husband Ted's work, looking at the fact that, in fact, fish stocks were not on average in the ocean. They existed in local populations. Herring is no better. This is the estimated stock abundance for herring. Again, the red arrow is when the act passed in 1970 or went into effect in 77. The herring is the food fish for the entire system. And you can see it's overfished. They now have finally put a restrictive quota on it. And we lost the outer Penobscot Bay spawning area also in the mid-90s when the Eastern Maine codfish collapsed. There could be a connection. What these graphs don't show is the impact on Maine fishermen. In response to these crises, groundfish stocks were privatized. Both the permits and the shares of the quota were given out as rights that can be bought and sold. It was designed to keep the government from difficult allocation decisions, and it promised efficiency in the use of capital for fishing. Unfortunately, the rights were given out after the Eastern Maine stocks collapsed. And so the many fishermen in Maine who fished many different fisheries through the year, lobster, groundfish, scallops, shrimp, lost their chance to ever go ground fishing again. Since then, the market for permits and quota has consolidated them largely in New Bedford. And at one point a few years ago, ownership of the many of those boats were in the hands of a Dutch hedge fund. That fund has since divested. And productive enough. Currently, the National Academy of Sciences is soliciting participation in the second of two studies, looking finally at the equity and distribution of groundfish access. Actually, of all fisheries nationwide who have been who this system has been used on. But lobstering shows another story, and this is what I want to talk about for the rest of the time. As I said, it's now a $464 million fishery, landing just under 100 million pounds. It's riding a natural, probably climate-driven population explosion that started in the mid-80s. Landings have gone as high as you can see as 133 million pounds, 6 times the long-term average that we had in the state before this explosion started. Lobster's managed very differently from those federal fisheries I was talking about earlier. It's managed collaboratively by the lobster producing states and the federal agency. And there are no quotas or output controls on the lobster fishery. What's important that I want you to know is what the lobster story shows, how it has succeeded in the face of the natural population explosion. Population explosions, because of human ingenuity and avarice, are often turning points for fisheries. A year class of haddock was what drew those foreigners to the Georges Bank back in the 60s. A huge bloom of urchins occurred in the 1980s and drew the Japanese market to Maine. It took only under 10 years for that fishery to collapse. So, lobster rules are really different. And I think that they provide a blueprint for managing fisheries in the future. And then to tie this to the use of the Gulf of Maine, they really provide a roadmap for how to think about caring for the natural productivity of this body of water and using it successfully in a human system. Many of you are probably familiar with the lobster rules. There are ecologically based rules. We protect juveniles, protect breeders, protect habitat by having traps only. Lobsters are easy because you can throw over, if you catch a small lobster or an egg-bearing female or a large breeder female, you can throw it back alive. So it's it's easier to do some of these things, but the point is they've done it. And if you invite other trap fishermen from other places around the world to see the lobster fishery, they are amazed by the number of potentially marketable animals that are thrown overboard by fishermen. There are limits to scale throughout the fishery, and this is just not something to take for granted. The technology is limited. We could catch lobsters by dragging them. It was a knockdown, drag out fight all the way through the 80s and 90s, trying to keep it a traps only fishery. We limit the size of traps. We limit the number of traps. We limit the geographical scope of the fishery by every Maine lobsterman is assigned a zone, chooses a zone to operate in, and he or she can fish only in one adjacent zone besides their home zone. In economics, there's a term called roving bandits about companies that can operate anywhere and can sweep in and basically skim the cream and be gone. Well, in fishing, this is exactly how it works. If we didn't limit geography, wherever there was a pulse of lobsters, that's where all the lobstermen in the Maine coast would be. We also limit the business structure of the industry. You have to be a Maine resident. You can only be an owner operator. Now, what this means is that the person who has the license, which gives them the right to harvest lobsters from the public resource, has to be on the boat. And at the end of their life, when they are too sick or die, they no longer fishing, there is nothing to sell. That is not an ownership right. They are just simply licensed to use the public resource. This is a profound difference from the federal approach I mentioned earlier, where the right to participate in the public fishery, in the public resource, was given out and became a property right that could be bought and sold. And finally, entry into the lobster fishery, which of course, when you don't have a market, you have to figure out another way to get young people into the fishery. And this now is based on a 2-year apprenticeship. So it's comparable to saying you have to go to school for 2 years in order to get your plumber's license or whatever. It's the same kind of idea. The irony of this is that the result is a small business industry with a lot of people who have a good, aggressive, competitive sense of being a businessman, and yet they are operating in a constrained use of a public resource. The other thing that lobster has going for it is the way science has evolved. In the federal fisheries, most of the science has to do with counting fish and prescribing what the quota should be. There's a lot of complex math, as any of you in population dynamics know, trying to account for the fact that things are dynamic or the fact that climate is changing or the whatever. But in lobster science, they're looking at all life stages. They're looking at the planktonic level. They're looking at settlement level. And it's collaborative. Fishermen are involved in the process. And because of the zone structure, with the zone council system that was set up with these zones, there is a vehicle for communication. It's not always excellent. And it doesn't always work the way one would hope it does. But it's structured in a way that is that really could successfully enlist those using the resource in caring for the resource. So, as it turns out, the lobster fishery was part of the research that Eleanor Ostrom, the political scientist from Indiana, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on the governance of common property resources. She worked with several people here, Jim Atchison and Jim Wilson, looking at the lobster fishery and the type of rules that had evolved out of traditional rules in the lobster fishery. And she, Ostrom developed these 8 design principles, and you'll see that lobster doesn't fit perfectly in this, but it fits pretty darn well. Clearly defined boundaries in those zones allow different decisions to be made in different ecologies along the Maine coast. Participatory decision-making through the zone councils, the monitoring and enforcement is mostly done by the state, but it's also done informally as well. And respect by the authorities, which is where I'm headed, which is that we could, in fact, conceivably manage fisheries more like lobster if the people at the top could believe that could be a better outcome than just controlling by numbers caught. And that comes to nested tiers of governance. So you have a local council, you have a local voting district, then you have the state, then you have the feds, and it works up. So what does this say for the Gulf of Maine development? I'm not so naive as to think that well-managed fisheries or our current fisheries could stop wind energy development or ocean aquaculture. But I firmly believe that the aspirational goal for fishing is important for the planet. We need to learn how to conduct business, provide jobs and food within the bounds of the systems that we're using. The Gulf of Maine is a really important laboratory for this. We've come so far with lobstering. And because of where Maine is in terms of its civil discourse and the number of people and the institutions like this that we have more of a chance than we would have if we were in the Keys or in Galveston Bay or whatever. It's important to look at these governance principles and the goal of actually not turning the Gulf of Maine into just land with a whole series of waste places where industrial development has happened. The lobster fishery has succeeded in conducting boom fishery in a way that has been sustainable so far in more than 50 communities along the Maine coast. That's incredible. It's not concentrated. It has not consolidated. I guess what I'm saying is we need to look at the at governance similar to um, what has happened in lobster, not only for other fisheries, but for how we address the use of the Gulf of Maine. And so I have a modest suggestion. There are millions, if not billions, going into some of these industrial uses of the Gulf. I'm sure that there are University of Maine professors working hard right now to submit a proposal to the Department of Energy. There's $7 million, $20 million coming out with a deadline of November 7th. What would happen? So there are also plenty of private investors looking at these businesses. Those private investors can't look at fishing as a place to invest because they can't invest in an owner operator. There's no way to get your money out. But what would happen if we started pouring comparable investments into the governance of fisheries? And in fact, the governance of the Gulf of Maine. When you walk these halls here in the Mitchell Center and look at the posters, there are networks, learning networks of clam learning network, and there's the river herring network, and there's the Damerscotter River that Heather Leslie wrote about in the oceans issue of the Maine Policy Review as giving her hope. There are lots of these little collaborative institutions that need support, and they aren't one-time solutions. It's not like investing in a machine and it's going to produce X number of widgets. These are human ecological systems, and they take governance that goes on forever. I guarantee you, lobster will need lots of governance in the future as the resource probably starts to go down and people start to have trouble. Ironically, when Wilson and I did the grant about the 200-mile limit back in the 70s, one of the things that came out of that grant was the Maine Fishermen's Forum. Mm. And better than any study that somebody should invest in, a fish filleting plant or whatever, that institution that is now 50 years old this year has probably done more for developing the social capacity of the Maine fishing industry to withstand shocks and preparing it for resilience that it's going to need. We can see it now with climate change. Before, we used to think everything was basically the same. Fish went in cycles, but it was pretty much going to be always looking the same. It's going to look very different, and it's going to take a lot of human capacity. One of the things I know about fishing is that if we apply these principles, we will no longer have single species fishermen. We'll have people caring for a specific area, looking at the interaction of the rivers and the alewives and the juvenile fish and the sea squirts and you name it, good and bad. When Maine fishermen protest about wind development, they're not only being greedy, they're also in anguish over the destruction of a place they know. Fishermen use wild places. They use it with a hunter's knowledge, and they know offshore places in a way that shore people don't. They can visualize shoals and boulders. They know where the kelp is. They know whether there might be coral. They know what time of year or on what tide given size fish of a certain species show up. They know what the bottom looks like, what color the mud is. In the future, as the Gulf of Maine changes, this knowledge is something that is a huge resource. And if we look at nested governance, that enlisting fishermen as part of the research, as part of the management, that will allow us to adapt and care for this place. So I guess I'm simply saying, don't forget that the Gulf of Maine is not just a place to do business. It's an ecological system and we need it, not just for fisheries, we need it for the planet. We should maybe take another look at the environmental constraints that we're putting on. You know, many of us are skeptical about whether those bonds that are going to clean up those industrial facilities at the end of it are going to actually work. Look at the paper companies and what we're dealing with in the wake of the paper companies. So let's be serious about this. This matters. And finally, what could we do if we invested in fisheries governance and it was official and the state and federal government agreed with this approach and supported the bottom-up development of capacity and care? Thank you very much.
First, everyone, can we give another round of applause for just a wonderful talk that is something that we're going to be thinking about for hours, for days, for weeks. Thank you very, very much. Very, very helpful where you in all the different things that you do, you put together a whole set of important ideas and help us take something that we've been thinking about for a while, but haven't brought the understanding of the complexity that you bring. And that's just so important that you're seeing the different pieces that come together and what we need to be thinking about to do things about this. One of the beginning questions is, students at UMaine, what would you see as their role to help with the future? And do you have any advice for what we should be doing as an institution?
Well, I just think getting involved in these collaborative efforts that the Mitchell Center is sparking is the most wonderful thing. It's one of the things, I'm on the advisory group for the Mitchell Center, and it's one of the things that I love about the center the most, because you get on the ground experience. And I know for me, I was 21 and I started interviewing fishermen sitting in their shops on the wharf, and it changed my life.
Very, very interesting. And one of the audience members, Richard Burrell, he's really interested in your points on the Gulf of Maine is heating up faster than most parts of all oceans. And he was asking, is this leading fish and crabs and others to move away from this area? And also in a second point he made, that to add to that since the warming is taking place in the Gulf of Maine and other plant species are coming, since it's getting hot further south. And do you have any thoughts about that? I don't know if I explained exactly his.
Okay, let me ask for a clarification. Was the first part, are the lobsters and crabs going to move away from this area?
Yes.
So, okay, I think the most important thing for me to say is nobody knows, or at least I don't know. And humility is important. We can't predict what's happening. They're not moving north right now. They're moving into cooler water, wherever that is. Sometimes it's east, sometimes it's deep, sometimes it's in the Gulf of Maine, that means it's south. But Canada caught, I can't remember the statistic, but Canada is catching more lobsters than we are in a given period of time. And that's a change. And lobsters are showing up in Newfoundland more than they have been before. So we're definitely seeing shifting behavior. But I will also say that the Gulf of Maine is not about to boil. And lobsters are going to be here for a long time. It may not be the pulse of abundance that we've seen since the 80s. That has been highly unusual in a historical context.
Really, really interesting. You talked about how important it is that we learn. And do you think that we can learn fast enough given the way things are changing? And how will we do that? What would you recommend?
Okay, that is the question, because the purpose of this approach that I'm talking about is that we need to learn fast. The only way you can deal with this kind of a system is to establish feedback loops, and they need to be at the local level, at the mid-range level, at the large level, and that can only be accomplished with governance, and that's why this is so important. And if we ignore local observations of climate-induced change, or the fact that the mussels aren't setting anymore, or whatever it is, we won't have the clues that can feed into knowledge that can really help us all.
You mentioned Ostram's design principles, her 8 design principles, very, very important. If we were to try to get those key ideas that she had into children's books, to start having children learn early and do it in a way, do you think that we could do that? Would that be a possibility at all?
We're too early. That's a great idea.
Are there other ways that you think children should be learning?
I hope there'll be lots of pictures of people talking together civilly.
In terms of children learning and other people learning, where can we read more about your important points and what you've done, and that we can go home and keep learning, even though we've only had 1 hour with you with all these great ideas?
My gosh, I'm stumped all of a sudden. I may have to think about that. Oh, there's somebody here who has an idea.
You could read your Maine policy review.
Oh, yes, perfect.
That's wonderful information.
Yes, Linda, the book that you edited.
Yes, yes. So exciting. We'd like to have you write more.
No, but tell us more about, I mean, that whole oceans issue of the Maine policy review had every kind of science you could imagine, or governance ideas, or, you name it. And so if you read that cover to cover, you'd be starting on this process.
And just to add one more thing to that, you can download any of the articles for free from the web. And if you go to the Maine Policy Review website, it will show you which articles are being downloaded anywhere in the world right now. And you can see who's reading the different things and get a sense of how we're all learning from each other.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, Linda, can I have a turn here?
Yeah, yeah, by all means.
David, thanks for that talk, Robin. I was really interested in your comparing like the way that lobster management has been different from the other fish species, and like I read about the lobster management case study as successful commons management before, and I was just thinking about like, do you think that the reason that went so differently is because lobster are more of a local fish creature? Sorry, I'm not a marine person, but lobster are only in a particular part of the country and part of the ocean, right? Where some of like, herring and such are much larger, widespread, and so harder to get that like local governance going because there's no boundaries around it that are easy for scientists to latch onto.
Well, if you think about the history of, well, let's just take herring and lobster.
Yeah.
Both of those were fixed gear fisheries. Herring was caught in weirs along the coast, little enclosures that the fish would swim into, and then they'd close the gate, catch them and pump them out. And lobster was caught in traps. And it was a very near shore activity. Herring was overfished to the point where, or technology developed so that then people started intercepting the fish before they got to the shore. And now they're caught in huge industrial scale nets.
Yeah.
Lobster was able to be a local cove by cove kind of fishery, and it developed very territorially, which is the major contribution that Jim Atchison gave to the literature. He made accessible to the academic world and the outside world something that fishermen knew but really wasn't known beyond that. And as it turns out, that territoriality is part of Ostrom's approach, boundaries, with boundaries. So I'm not sure I answered fully your question.
So I guess you're saying you could do that with with like herring, for example. There could be a natural territory drawn around it that fishermen would understand. It's just that got overtaken by the privatization.
It's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. But I think the best time to do that often is when things are at a low point. The hardest time is in population explosion. And if we hadn't had the lobster rules we had, we would have had smart Maine fishermen saying, I'll get another boat. I'll get another boat. I'll get a bigger boat. I think I'm going to go from Casco Bay down to Penobscot Bay where the boom is right now. And we would have had exactly what we've had in the other fisheries. And I might add much faster. We may be doing closer to that now, but you know, nothing stays the same. Nothing's perfect.
Thanks.
So Linda, I think we're at time. I know there's other things in the chat that we're going to be able to share with Robin. Is that okay?
You bet. You bet. And
Well,
thank you so much for helping us all learn.
yeah, thanks, Robin. Great talking. Thanks, Linda.
Yeah.